Good afternoon and welcome to today's presentation, What's on the Horizon for Trade Policy and Sourcing. I'm Julie Hughes, President of the U.S. Fashion Industry Association, and I'll be presenting today with Dr. Sheng Lu from University of Delaware. I'm going to kick us off, and then Sheng is going to get into the sourcing discussion. So let's get started. Whoops, there we go. Let's get started here. So first, for those of you who I don't know and don't know me, just a little bit about USFIA. Our mantra is fashion made possible by global trade. And that reflects the fact that our members are American brands and retailers doing business around the world. And our mission is to make it easier for them to do that business and be successful. So how do we do that? We focus on communication, education, and advocacy for the industry on a range of issues from trade policy and sustainability and business practices. But let's start talking though about trade policy and the trends and challenges for 2021. So obviously a challenge as we're in year 2 of COVID-19 world is building new sourcing strategies. And Sheng's going to talk a lot about the sourcing strategies, but there's an intersection between sourcing strategies and trade policy. So I'm going to talk about responding to a new trade policy since we have a new administration. So let's look at the trade policy highlights. And I have to start first with a slide that I didn't think I would still be using in September of 2021. And that is that the Biden administration is continuing the key elements from the Trump years. So, after the election and the inauguration in January, I think many folks thought we're going to see a lot of things very different from during the past 4 years, and that trade policy would be one of them. But unfortunately, from my perspective, the tariffs and the trade wars are not over. We continue to have a major focus on, tariffs remain in place on China in particular, those 301 tariffs. Tariffs remain in place on solar panels, on washing machines, on steel and aluminum imports. A lot of the penalty tariffs that the Trump administration put in place are still in place today and are costing consumers millions of dollars. So this is obviously a big problem. It's a concern. It's an issue for our members. And, we continue to press the Biden administration that it's time for a change. But, as of today, that change is not immediately on the horizon. So, and why is that? I mean, part of it is that China remains the main target when you hear concerns about trade policy and foreign policy to some extent. And indeed, Washington has been a bit abuzz with a kind of the rumor mill of will there be new tariffs and sanctions? So there have been press reports and there have been discussions of the potential that the Biden administration may continue the playbook from the Trump administration and actually file a new 301 against China. That would be a broader 301 against China and give them a chance to do their own analysis and investigation, and then the potential for changing the tariffs, changing the product coverage, based on their own analysis. Since early in the administration, at the top officials, including the U.S. Trade Representative and at the White House level, have said they are conducting a whole of government review of the U.S.-China relationship. Once again, my frustration is we would have hoped by mid-September that review would be finished, but that is still ongoing. So we remain concerned today, and trade wars are still ongoing. We are basically, a bit of a Groundhog Day on trade policy where things have not yet changed as much as we would have liked. So China remains the main target. Congress is expected to approve legislation this year that we would definitely call anti-China, focused also on China. So not just the Biden administration, but Congress as well. The Senate passed legislation earlier this summer, and we're still waiting for House consideration. We're not sure when the House is going to act. So many folks thought the House was going to act quickly this summer before the summer recess. Congress is back today, and I don't have to tell any of you, if you look at the newspaper or have news pop up on your computer screen, that the Congress is a bit distracted right now with a real focus on the budget. What's going to happen with government funding? What's going to happen? Are we going to increase the debt ceiling? So there are many critical issues right now before the Congress, and we're not likely to see the action on China as quickly as we thought before, but still expect that we will see some action this year. Now, part of what's been driving the issue here is some of the concern about forced labor, and particularly the issues with Xinjiang in China. The administration, this is the old one, but this July also, the Biden administration issued an updated business advisory on the Xinjiang supply chain, and forced labor and accusations of forced labor remain a top trade policy concern. So we continue to see that. So if we look not from the perspective of what's a China issue, but what's the focus for the administration, there are really 4 issues that the administration has pretty consistently focused on. One is worker issues and labor rights. That's not just a China issue, that's a much broader issue, looking at worker issues, whether they're in Western Hemisphere, whether it's in Myanmar. There is a focus, and the administration has continued to have that as a top priority. If you look at the readouts from the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, what you would see is that many of the meetings that the USTR has are with labor groups and are focused on how U.S. trade policy can be more worker-centric and worker-focused. In addition to worker and labor rights, climate change and sustainability is another top trade policy issue for the Biden administration. And this week, of course, we've seen meetings on climate change and discussion about sustainability. That will continue, although how that's going to intersect with trade policy is not quite clear yet. But we know that, for example, even at the World Trade Organization, they're looking at a declaration for consideration at the ministerial in November that's on climate change and trade policy. So we expect we're going to see more of that. The third issue is the migration crisis. And, when I put this slide together, obviously that was a big issue, but not quite as big as we're seeing it today, right? The issue at the border with the Haitian migrants is in the news, but the migration crisis and the continuing flow of people trying to come to the U.S. For a better life, that is another crisis that perhaps trade policy may play a role in. And then last, cybersecurity, which is linked to trade policy and an international issue, and remains a top priority for the Biden administration. So a lot on their plate, and a lot of these things that have blown up, you could argue, in the last few weeks. So just to kind of go back to, there's the crisis at the border, but there is one direct link to trade policy, and that is perhaps an opportunity to expand Western Hemisphere sourcing because of that focus on the migration crisis, and particularly the Northern Triangle. And so we are definitely engaged in discussions with the administration and with our colleagues in the CAFTA region, Central America and Western Hemisphere, on what might be ways to expand sourcing, create more jobs in the textile and apparel sector that will keep people from traveling to the border, coming to the U.S., because they're going to have better jobs back at home. So another key priority. There should be an event later this month with the Vice President looking at these issues. So that is another trade policy, I would say an opportunity, not necessarily a negative. What else does Congress have to do? And there's kind of there are a couple of pieces of legislation and actions that we're looking for Congress to take action on that will affect our trade policy. One is to renew GSP. So for those of you who don't deal with it every day, GSP is the generalized system of preferences that gives duty-free benefits, not to apparel, not to footwear, but to a lot of other products, hardline products, some carpets, and travel goods. So a lot of bags and travel goods are eligible for duty-free access to the U.S. market if they're coming from a developing country. Unfortunately, this expired at the end of last year, and the Senate renewed it. Once again, the House has not acted yet, and we need the House to also renew GSP. Just yesterday, we joined a letter with 300 companies and associations to the Hill, encouraging the House to act as soon as possible to renew this, because obviously sourcing patterns are going to shift if companies have to pay the tariffs and are not sure when it will be duty-free or when they might get back their tariffs. We also need to renew the miscellaneous tariff bill provisions, and this is another piece of legislation that the Senate acted. They passed it. The House has not yet acted, and it's incredibly complicated. So I'm only going to say here that there is a process to request also duty-free access or reduced duty access for products that don't compete with U.S. production, where the International Trade Commission will do an analysis, the administration experts will review that, the Congress will approve it for additional duty-free access. Not that many apparel products and textile products are eligible for MTB, but it's global. It's not restricted to developing countries. And it is a benefit that a number of companies are using, and it's another tool in your sourcing toolbox. Congress also needs to act on Trade Promotion Authority, which expired this summer. And, Trade Promotion Authority, without Trade Promotion Authority, which means that the Congress cannot change a negotiated text of an agreement, no administration is going to negotiate new agreements. And there has been building pressure for the U.S. to complete the negotiations with the United Kingdom. The previous administration also started negotiations with Kenya that are, I think, not as far along as the UK, but still are something that I think trade officials in this administration are interested in. But the Congress will need to approve Trade Promotion Authority. And frankly, given the dysfunction that we have been seeing lately, it will be a hard ask for Republicans to support Trade Promotion Authority for a Democratic president, and that's likely to slow us down on new trade agreements that are negotiated. So what's next? So we're waiting for action on trade policy. There are a lot of issues the Biden administration, they need to act on, and we're waiting to see what they're going to do. The Congress hasn't acted. We're waiting to see what they're going to do. And that kind of leaves the rest of us, I call it stakeholders here, but so the rest of us, what are we going to do, and how can we, push for, how can we really promote our advocacy and make recommendations until we have a better sense of what is the path forward on trade policy with any of the key decision makers here in Washington. So I'm going to end there, which sounds kind of depressing, but it's really not. I'm going to turn it over to Sheng so we can do a deep dive on the sourcing side and then see what questions you all have. So Sheng, you're in control.
Sure. Thank you, Julie. Thank you so much for the valuable updates, and also thank you for joining us this afternoon. Somehow, Julie, you leave me with the impression I'm not definitely jealous about being a sourcing manager these days. or being an apparel exporter, there are so many things to worry about. Somehow we thought 2021 will be a relatively easy year for trade, but looks like this is not the case. I'm an economist and also a scholar. So I will try to, walk you through, the trade impact of these, trade policies or the current business environment, especially what are some of the latest sourcing trends or sourcing strategies adopted by U.S. fashion brands and retailers. So my presentation will leverage two major data sources. One is from the government data, but also I want to highlight, so I have the great pleasure working with Julie and her organization, the U.S. Fashion Industry Association, in the past 8 years. So we produced this annual benchmarking study, directly talked to leading U.S. fashion brands and the retailers to try to understand their latest sourcing strategy, their concern, and how they're reacting to some of the issues like trade policy, trade war, or COVID-19. And the latest study was conducted from this April to June, and we were lucky to have about 31 very large U.S. fashion brands and retailers to talk to us and share their inputs. Throughout the whole study, two words still come to my mind. They're the themes for this year, that is trade policy and COVID-19, especially COVID-19. So how to understand COVID-19's impact on our sector. So Julie have seen this graph, I think, more than 5 times at least. But still, I have so many to say and so many to recall from this graph. So here, I try to compare the recovery process or the trade volume during COVID-19 versus during the 2008 financial crisis, because the financial crisis was the last time our industry was significantly hit. But if you look at these two graphs, okay, they share very little in common, right? And just recall, or reminds us, COVID-19 is very different from the 2008 financial crisis. How so? One is, if you look at the red line, this is what's happening with COVID. It's so fluctuating, right? Like at the very beginning, when COVID initially started, because of those lockdown measures, and all of a sudden, U.S. trade volume was hit by more than half, okay? And this is really unprecedented. And then, very interesting, just in 1 month, we started to see recovery. And to be honest, based on the strict economic definition, we cannot even call it a recession because economic recession has to last for a couple of months. But you only have 1 month, you started to see recovery. So that's very interesting. And the recovery was very robust until late 2020. Like November into December. And what happened? Because we were hit by the second and the third wave of COVID. Okay, so those optimism actually was hit by a kind of downturn. And then if you look at what happened at the beginning or the first several months of 2021, also kind of really unprecedented. All of a sudden the trade volume doubled. Okay, and then what happened? Especially in recent months, we start to see significant drop again, okay? Just think of yourself like a sourcing manager or as a company. I do not call this like something necessarily encouraging or something kind of, kind of very ideal, because business need a foreseeable or predictable business environment. But now, because of COVID, COVID sets the agenda. It's not like us. It's not like a pure economic crisis. We can use traditional economic tools to really manage or forecast what might happen next. But COVID this time really leave us with a lot of uncertainty. And the same can be reflected in this graph. So I look at the monthly trade data. By the way, if you look at monthly trade data, you have to, I have to emphasize, you have to look at the seasonally adjusted data, because this time it did show us two different trends. If you look at the raw data, it tells us, oh, trade volume actually is going up. However, if you remove the seasonal factor, actually you can see trade volume went down. Why? Because usually, June to September, okay, is the period for companies to import a lot of products to support their holiday sales. But if you remove these seasonal factors, actually trade volume went down. what happened? I think one is, probably is the shipping crisis. Even though consumers want products, importers want to get the products, but you can't. It got stuck, at the port. But also, I think it's about COVID. We were hit by the Delta variant. I think this also had a significant impact, on both the apparel, exporting country like Vietnam, like Bangladesh, you name it. These Southeast Asian countries, they were hit by the new round of lockdown, but also retailers, they were hard to get the products. Okay, so this is the environment, and another major impact of COVID is cost. I don't know how you feel about this graph. I feel very hot, very hot. Put it this way, in the past, we can always identify 1 to 2 particular factors that affect the sourcing cost the most. Say, this year is labor cost. The other year is raw material cost. But this year, 2021, almost everything becomes more expensive, especially shipping and logistics, really unprecedented, okay? And also raw material is on the rise, and you can see how much pressure companies face, okay? And unfortunately, companies tell us they do not see the rising sourcing cost. This trend will go away anytime soon. Why? Because just look around, the whole economy is under very big pressure for inflation. Okay, so a lot of things are becoming further more expensive. So companies have to deal with such a cost pressure for an extended period of time. So this is the business environment. So think about if you are the fashion brands and retailers, how you are responding to the current business environment, how you're going to decide where to source your products. So this is what our surveyed companies, the respondents tell us their strategies in response to the current business environment. 2 things to highlight. One is what companies do not do, and you can see at the bottom, companies are not canceling orders anymore. So this is a kind of less popular strategy compared with last year. So we know last year when COVID initially broke out, canceling order, is relatively, popular, but this year is no longer the case. Okay, and a second, and you can see 2 things really stand out from companies' response. One is they saying, okay, I want to strengthen my relations with my key vendors. Okay, I want to, kind of build more closer or stronger relationship with my long-term business partners. And a second, in terms of the most important or primary sourcing factors, they emphasize a lot on sourcing cost. Okay, that's easy to understand, but also it's about flexibility and agility. Okay, so these are 2 things I see from the data. So this is from where the U.S. companies source their products. So this is the trade data, and I update it each month. And to be honest, I do not really see a lot of change. Somehow I find this is a little bit boring, but this also just showcase. You can ask this question. Why? On the one hand, the business environment changes so much, but the result is Asia remains the dominant, so stable, dominant sourcing base for U.S. brands and retailers. I think this is a worthwhile question to ask. And this is our survey data, and it is highly, highly consistent with the macro trade data. Still, you can see 9 out of the top 10 most utilized sourcing bases, they're based in Asia. The only exception is Guatemala, okay, which come from Central America. Okay, but still Asia is the dominant sourcing base. And so in general, here just want to show something that you cannot see from the trade data. Okay, so on the one hand, still companies adopt a relatively diverse sourcing base. So or at least we can put it this way: companies are not putting all their eggs in one basket. Okay, so typically, large companies with 1,000 employees, they were sourced from more than 10 different countries. Okay, but also at the same time, you can see, especially for relatively large companies, I find if you look at the results in the past few years, their sourcing base this year is relatively less diversified. They're relatively less diversified. Okay, and I think this is a very interesting and important trend, and I will explain more in detail later. Okay, and the most popular sourcing base, the most popular sourcing practices, and I call it China plus Vietnam plus many. So how to understand this pattern or this practice? So one is, if you look at breakdown companies' detailed sourcing portfolio, about 20 to 40% now come from China and Vietnam. But still, there are some changes, compared with the past. So in the past, China plus Vietnam is about 40 to 60. So this time is relatively smaller share. And also in the past, especially before we had the tariff war, China, normally was number one. But this year it's really hard to tell, okay, whether China or Vietnam was the largest source of products. And many companies actually they source more from Vietnam than from China. I think this is a very important trend. So kind of companies treat Vietnam as a place to source volume products. But for China, they probably still use as a place to source more variety kinds of products. Okay, so in addition to these two sources, and companies also source from the rest of Asia, from South America, from AGOA regions, but each of these sourcing base will account for less than 10% of the total sourcing value of volume. So this is what I mean: China plus Vietnam plus many. Okay. And previously, the previous slides are all about apparel sourcing, and here, this year we also asked about the source of textile raw material, okay, because these days, how to understand the whole supply chain is very important. And compared with apparel, I have to say, textile sourcing is even more concentrated on Asia and more concentrated on China. Okay, especially these days, even though you may see fewer apparel labeled made in China, but China is playing a more significant role as a leading textile supplier for many Asian countries, for many apparel exporting countries in Asia. So this is also a very important trend we can watch. So this is the most popular, I have to say this is the most popular graph in our whole report, which is 60 pages long these days, but it's the most popular, really the most popular one. So here we ask respondents to provide their evaluation, okay, about the competitiveness or the advantages and the disadvantages of some of the leading sourcing bases against the 5 or 6 primary sourcing criteria, from sourcing cost, speed to market, flexibility, agility to compliance risk. Okay, and here, I like to look at this graph from a little bit different perspective from our study. So here I want to see how so we know. Okay, yeah, and here we go. So we know China, Vietnam, Indonesia, India, they're the top sourcing base for U.S. fashion companies. And I want to see, what these countries are mostly good at doing, what they're mostly competitive about. And you can see here, they're most competitive in terms of sourcing cost and flexibility and agility, right? So this is kind of, mirror or kind of, recall what I just mentioned earlier. Companies these days, they really emphasize a lot on these 2 sourcing factors during COVID. So in terms of sourcing costs, it's relatively easy to understand. You just need to compare their average cost or their labor cost. It's very easy to measure. But how to measure, okay, flexibility and agility, okay? So here, this is one perspective. So there are many perspectives to look at. Here is one perspective. So I checked a database that can show us what products are available in the U.S. retail market, especially at the very detailed product level. And you can see, for those apparel labeled made in China, okay, and these are also relatively new data during COVID, okay. So for these apparel labeled made in China, they almost cover any products, any category, okay. in other words, companies these days, they can really source any products from China. Okay, this is about their production capacity, very complete production base. Okay, if you look at the product assortment of made in Vietnam, made in Bangladesh, relatively less diversified, but overall, no, it is still okay. It is still okay. But if you look at Mexico, okay, the vast majority of products labeled made in Mexico in the U.S. market, they are in the categories of tops, much more concentrated. But also means Mexico probably don't have a lot of capacity, okay, for making a variety of kinds of products. The same issue can be found if you look at the product assortment of those items sourced from Central America, especially CAFTA members. Still mostly about tops, bottoms. So probably this explains why Asia remains the dominant sourcing base, because we need all different kinds of clothing in our daily life. Even if you want to source more from Central America, from North America, but still maybe you can only do so for limited categories of products. Okay, so this is how I interpret flexibility and agility. And another very interesting thing to look at is companies emerging sourcing trend, what they plan to do over the next 2 years. I do remember before like 2018, always we find companies say, okay, I want to keep expanding, keep exploring new sourcing countries, try to work with new vendors. But this year, okay, more popular sourcing strategy is, okay, they want to, it does not mean they're necessarily leaving any country, but they are trying to work with fewer vendors. Okay, companies try to work with fewer vendors, and the reason is they want to, like I've mentioned earlier, they want to strengthen their relationship with key vendors, And we further ask companies why you want to work with fewer suppliers, and you can see the comments from our companies. Really, they want to leverage their relationship. They want to make themselves also as a prioritized client for these vendors. So maybe in case they have to ask the vendors to ship something faster, or maybe give the priority to make their products based on the long-term business relationship, they can make it happen. Or put it this way, okay? So this is my interpretation. It's not necessarily the case that companies just newly want to achieve flexibility or agility in sourcing. So this kind of expectation existed in the past. But in the old days, the traditional way of thinking is how to achieve flexibility. Let me source from more countries. Let me work with more vendors. Then I can have the so-called flexibility. Okay, this vendor does not work, then I can easily switch my sourcing orders. But these days, because we have to work with fewer resources, but to achieve flexibility. So another option to do that is to work with the most capable, the most competitive vendors. For example, okay, my vendor, they not only have factory in China, but also they have the production capacity in South America, in Vietnam, in Bangladesh, in more than 10 different countries. Of course, they can allow me to have flexibility in case I have to deal with some unexpected kind of situation in one country. I can easily find an alternative. Or maybe I can work with a vendor that has the vertical manufacturing capability. Okay, so previously I have to worry about where to get the textiles, where to source the fabric, but now my vendor can make fabrics by themselves, right? So isn't working with the most competitive vendors can also help companies, fashion brands, and retailers achieve flexibility and agility. But the implication is, these days, probably it's no longer just about China compete with Vietnam or Vietnam compete with Bangladesh, but vendors within these countries, they compete with each other. So we know there are over 5,000 factories in Bangladesh. Maybe those most competitive ones, okay, they will get more sourcing orders versus those less competitive ones. So I think this is a very interesting trend we can keep watching. Okay. One last point is about, like Julia mentioned earlier, in the past, I do not see very strong kind of signal near sourcing is coming back. It's very popular. It's always very popular, but just I do not see that from the data. But this time, at this point, I see more strong signal. If you look at the most recent trade data, both in terms of quantity and in terms of value, Capital DR members, they're gaining more market share. If you look at how we can further encourage more sourcing from Capital members, from USMCA members. Here are the comments or suggestions from our respondents, and you can read them as a whole story. Okay, and my comment is focus on fabrics. Focus on textile raw material. Why companies feel sourcing from Central American countries from NAFTA is too expensive? Because they have to use very expensive textile raw material. There are too limited regional supply of textile, especially if you have to comply with the so-called yarn forward rules of origin, right? But if you can somehow help companies to more easily get access to these textile raw material, the final price of the products can also be lowered, and also those garment factories in Central America can also have more flexibility in making products. Okay, but still, I think this region, I totally agree with Julie. This region involves a lot of potential opportunity, and I definitely wouldn't be surprised to see more investments go to this region, especially to support the Biden administration's kind of priority, or try to use this region as a tool to solve some non-economic kind of purposes. Okay, so that's my presentation. Thank you very much, and I'll be happy to work with Julie to answer some of the questions from our participants. So.
Thanks.